I'm fascinated by this idea of African cities of tomorrow for three main reasons. The first reason being, I don't want African cities to turn up as replicas of Western cities like New York and London, which are defined by how large, how tall, and how wide we build. The other reason is because of this phenomenon of rapid urbanization. By the year 2050, over 70% of the global population will be living in cities, which means that we shall be faced with challenges of how to make our cities more livable. The third reason, which is also related to the second reason of rapid urbanization, is that African cities are actually places of opportunity. They are places where people go to get better jobs, to get a good education. They are places that people go to fall in love and realize their dreams. In particular, I went to the city because I wanted to get an education. Before moving to the city, I grew up along the equator in a small but beautiful country called Uganda, right in the heart of Africa. I was raised by my grandmother. My grandmother was so hardworking, but she was also very knowledgeable in so many aspects of life. In particular, I was fascinated by how much understanding she had regarding seasons and how they dictated the everyday life, progress, and time. So she taught me lots of things. One of the things she taught me was how to tell time using shadows and the sun. It's a skill that took me time to learn. But eventually I got it. And I remember that day going down with my colleagues right at the equator. We went and measured the direction, the length, and the shape of our shadows. And we could tell what time it was. We didn't use watches or clocks. All we needed was the sun and shadows. The other reason I love my time with my grandmother was that I got to understand the value of sharing. We shared almost everything. And by everything, I mean from food to farming tools. We shared different ways of knowing herbs or medicinal plants. And we didn't actually use money because the concept of money was non-existent when I was growing up. In fact, the very first time I got to use money was at the age of 12, and that's when I moved to the city. I also loved the home I grew up in. It was a simple, nice place to live in, made out of mud, bamboo, and grass. You know, the construction of these homes was communal. Us, the children, we went fetching water for the mud, and then we also occasionally went out to get the grass for the roof. This kind of architecture is known as vernacular architecture. It makes use of biodegradable materials which have no harm to the environment. So eventually, I left my precious grandmother and I moved to the city. So you can imagine, I left that place for that place. And it was a total culture shock, a big culture shock in so many ways. First of all, I got to understand that, you know, life in the city plays by different rules, that everything costs something. Everything costs money. And it was at that point that I got to understand the value of money. I also noticed that, you know, the noise, the noise of the vehicular traffic had actually replaced the good sounds of the birds. Everyone was minding their own business. Everyone was rushing somewhere, or they seemed to rush somewhere. And then the air didn't smell as fresh as the one back home in my remote rural village. But what hurt me the most, and so frustrating it was the fact that none of these people seemed to appreciate the sun and the shadow, the way my grandmother, the way I and the village folks did. And I couldn't blame them. I understood why. Because the city was littered with lots of city clocks everywhere. So, you know, to me, the city became a place that was a constant reminder of how us humans had forgotten how to live, of how detached we had become to nature and its wonders. So I decided to dedicate the rest of my life to rethinking how we live, how we work, how we play, and how we consume in cities. I decided to study architecture. And while in architecture school, I got introduced to sustainable architecture. I got introduced to green technologies, to low-cost housing, to emergent shelters, and all those aspects of architecture that I used as a tool for community revitalization. I later moved on. I went abroad for further education, and I met lots of people, worked with them on different projects. And they taught me lots of things, because there are people from different walks of lives all over the globe. But one of the lessons I learned from them was the fact that buildings provide more than just shelter. They are places within which people and around which communities are organized. Now, I work in different facets of life. I work with participatory design. I work with the urban poor. I work with the urban poor because, like me, many people left the rural landscape for the towns in search of better opportunities. But when they reached the towns, they faced the realities of town life. There weren't enough jobs, they were not qualified enough, and some of them were just not lucky enough. So they took on alternative ways of living, using the knowledge they had picked from their villages. One of them is urban agriculture. People engage in urban agriculture, making use of these spaces, lost spaces within the cities, to grow crops, sell them to passers-by, and then earn an income to feed their families and take their children to school. I'm interested in such spaces because these spaces provide green in a city where accessibility to public space is actually not thought about. But also, I like these spaces because they enhance the biodiversity of the cities. So knowing their economic, environmental, and social impacts, I aspire towards a kind of architecture that integrates agro-based livelihoods of the urban poor into the urban fabric. The other aspect I work with is creating multi-generational neighborhoods, places where the elderly, the young, and the very little can actually live, meet, and learn from each other. In Uganda, we have a situation known as the fatherless generation, where we have energetic and productive young men and women who are lost to war or disease. And as such, their children were raised by their grandparents. But our grandparents, because they are old and retired, they have no source of income. And given that our social security system is not reliable, they need a source of living or a way of raising these children. So why not set up a community where they can live dignified lives? This particular project is known as the Potter's Haven. It's inspired by a local tradition of pottery making. Where I come from, pots are very essential because we use them to fetch water, we use them to cook, we use them for storage of valuable materials, and we use them for ornamental purposes. In this particular project, we use them for vertical gardening. And why vertical gardening? It's key because the elderly suffer from wear and tear of their backs as they bend to tend to their gardens. So with vertical gardens, they can actually grow food without worrying about wear and tear of their backs. Within these prototypes, we have spaces for communal gardening. And we use locally available materials like bamboo and steel pots, which are easy to construct and erect. So within these spaces, we grow food which can supplement the diets of the households. I also worked with an organization called Watoto Child Ministries. And their objective is to get children orphaned by HIV/AIDS and war and give them a decent education and shelter. And within these villages, we constructed different homes based on the African notion of it takes a village to raise a child. As you can see, the homes are arranged around an outdoor space known as the courtyard. And this is a communal space where children play safely away from the roads. But also when the children are off to school, these become important spaces for the mothers because they do laundry and then they dry the clothes under the sun. But they also meet to talk about different challenges and they learn from each other. I eventually ended up in Sweden to pursue a master's in sustainable urban planning and design. And while in Sweden, I've come to appreciate the need to have a global perspective on issues. Why? Because I understood that actually the problems we face locally back home have a global impact in so many ways. Take, for instance, climate change or rapid urbanization. Because our cities are growing at such a very fast rate, there is need for more housing. But as we build more houses, we encroach on on habitats for so many plant and animal species. Take, for instance, the birds. This particular image shows a mapping of a bird known as the barn swallow, which travels over 6,500 miles from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. And along its journey, it passes through war zones in the jungles of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It goes through harsh climatic conditions in the Sahara Desert. Then it eventually reaches the Mediterranean region, where it's subjected to illegal hunting. It goes through Europe, where it is subjected to light pollution. So by the time it reaches up the northern hemisphere, the numbers have reduced tremendously. So we thought, why not come up with some sort of urban language which merges the natural and the built environments? This is a proposal for one of the green spaces in Stockholm, which is actually a contested space in so many ways. So we thought, why not incorporate vertical landscapes for the birds to nest and rest and refuel within the proposed housing? And one thing I love about these vertical landscapes is that they are adaptive landscapes in a way. Because all the birds are away during winter, the vertical landscapes take on a different character. They become spaces for winter sports. In spring, plants start growing, and these plants provide nesting and building materials for the birds. During summer, they took on an economic aspect because lots of tourists come into the city. So what happens is that there's a lot of bird watching going on, and which actually adds an economic dimension to the city because it's a source of income. But also we can have urban agriculture go on the rooftops. So it's kind of a closed loop. This trying to merge the natural and the built environments. All my work, I think it's clear that I try to work with the three facets of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. I'd like to leave us with a quote, an old African quote, proverb, which goes, "Treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents. It was loaned to you by your children." Treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents. It was loaned to you by your children. And I think that should be the mandate of each one of us, to make sure that we live or we work towards a better future for our children and our children's children. But for us to do that, we need to rethink how we live in cities. Thank you very much.